I would like to first invite Professor Alexander BUZGALIN. He's from the Lomonosov Moscow State University in Russia, and we've known each other actually for quite long. I've been to Moscow, and then Alexander had been to Beijing, so there had been a lot of dialogue already going on, and Alexander, he's also a coordinator of the social movement called Alternatives. And he's also a member of the organizing committee of the Russian Social Forums. He has written more than 350 publications, including 26 monographs and more than 100 articles published in Russian scientific journals, such as on economic issues, on problems of philosophy. So we are very, very pleased and honored to have you with us. So now over to you, Alexander.
First of all, thank you very much to all organizers of the conference, and thank you very much to Kenchi. You made a great job with your colleagues, and of course I want to say hello, I want to say здравствуйте, I want to say ni hao, but unfortunately I can't speak in different languages, except English and Chinese, and Russian. I haven't forgot Russian, and my presentation will be in English. Of course, topic of the globalization is extremely important, and this is a topic for debates for more than 2-3 years, but not for 2 decades. It's also important. It's urgent topic, if I can say so. And also, it is important to remind that 30 years ago, a person who I even don't want to pronounce his name, wrote the book "The End of the History." And you know, and everybody knows that there is no end of the history. The end of the history, what we have now, the end of the ideas of Fukuyama and all neoliberal speakers, researchers, politicians who made a neoliberal model, transfer neoliberal model into something universal for all countries, for all people, and so on. At least they made global attempt to do this. And first of all, I want to make a brief introduction as an academic person and to say that we must define globalization. What is globalization? And of course, this is a process. And this process has measure. So we never had 100% globalization, and we never will have no globalization more. So this is important. We have qualitative and quantitative characteristics of globalization as a process. But still, what is globalization? For me, this is domination of global players, global actors, and the situation when the global economy is now space, or it was space, for relations between global players, mainly, and much less for national states. It was competition between Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola in Moscow, in Beijing, in villages of India, everywhere. It was competition of Japanese and European cars. It was a competition of airplanes from Europe and airplanes from the United States, which are dominating everywhere. And this is not dominating of the state, domination of the state. This is a domination of transnational corporations, financial capital, transnational financial capital, and so on. This is a process of globalization, domination of these players. And vice versa, when we have more separation, growth of national states, their role as regulators, when we have main force in the hands not of the global market, but in the hands of local market, this is deglobalization, opposite process. But what we have now, from one hand, Russia is a very specific country in this case. It's very visible, all contradictions of globalization in our country. From one hand, we have very patriotic, with positive and negative sense of this word, very patriotic government, very patriotic ideology, even attempts to show that Russia is the only good country and everybody is against, maybe a little bit with China and India as our possible partners, but definitely all others are enemies. But what we have great dependence from oil prices, from world financial markets, from dollar, majority of Russians still have accumulations in dollars and euros, not in rubles, and so on and so far. We have domination of transnational corporations. We have Chinese dress and equipment. So do we have globalization in Russia? Yes, we do. And in very, very strong scale, and the measure of globalization is high, in spite of the fact of all these political, ideological, and even military attempts to show that we are independent. So that's why we must understand, all time we have this globalization. Second, what is important, globalization is, has different aspects, and it's very important to understand this. First aspect, background, real internationalization of technologies. I don't know if anybody is against global distribution of internet connections, universal transport system, global salvation of climate problem, and so on and so forth. And this is globalization in, let's say, technological global, globalization, global content of this world. But then we have social, economic, and political forms of globalization. And here we have something opposite. We have domination of totalitarian market, global totalitarian market. We have domination of global capital, especially financial capital, global mass media, and even global ideology. And this is not problem of domination of the United States. I will give you one example. I had lectures in many cities of China, and I was in many cities in Europe, in Latin America. I'm not speaking about the United States and Russia. I put question to the students. What kind of movie did you see during last month? 90% Hollywood blockbusters. And this is not problem of America. This is a problem of, let's say, choice, emotions, motivation, what is more important, and even more important, values of people. And values of people, motivation of people are determined by global market. And globalization, first of all, is not formal unity of any, I don't know, features, visible features. First of all, this is domination of global market and global actors, transnational corporations, first of all. What does it mean? It means that we are semi-slaves, puppets in the hands of this global capital. We can have choice to take product of Japanese, I don't know, Chinese, US or European global corporation to buy the car. But we don't have the choice, really, not to buy the car, because if you don't have prestige car, you are nobody. I don't know about Hong Kong, but in Russia, if professor doesn't have Jeep, big car, yeah, which is useless in the city, he's not respectable professor. I don't have car at all, and I'm respectable, but everybody show he is strange guy. This is funny, but this is important. This is not market. This is a system of competition of manipulators. Because corporation, through marketing, through PR, through all channels, creates special system of consumption, special system of production, special system of thinking, and so on. And if we had in the beginning of 20th century, products produced by engineers and workers, now we have products produced by marketeers and financial bosses. And this is not joke. And even more, we have market, which is now more and more market of simulacra, market of sign, market of label. If I have in the jacket Hugo Boss, of course I don't have. This is good jacket. If I don't have this, this is bad jacket. If it is jacket with Moscow, I don't know, factory, it will cost $50. If it is Hugo Boss, it will be $500 or maybe $5,000. For what? $500 minus 50. 450 for label. Label is main commodity. And this is not simply brand. This is absolutely another virtual economy when people have fictitious needs, which are satisfied by fictitious science in order to have fictitious satisfaction. And this is globalization in very high stage of development. And when we are trying to create the same science produced by our own corporations for our people, even it will be everybody in China, Chinese, in Russia, Russian, in US, US, it will means nothing. It will be the same global domination of capital, maybe with national registration and national symbol. We have funny example of this in Russia with this growth of patriotism. Russian chocolate is very popular, but this is not Russian chocolate. This is Nestle, but the sign on the chocolate is Russian. Russian puppet, Matryoshka, and sign Alenka, but this is Nestle. So they are just have camouflage, another sign. So that's why when we are talking about deglobalization, we must first of all put the question. If it is real decline of the power of global market, global corporations, global financial capital, or not. And what we in Russia, in China, in US, in European Union, what we want, what do we want? We want to change the system of domination of totalitarian market of simulacra and global financial capital, or we simply want to change the names for this domination. Instead of transnational names, to receive national names, to create national ideology and so on. I will move to this question a little earlier. What is here very important? One of the most important aspects is we are now have result of negation of imperialism of the beginning of 20th century. I read again books and texts of Lenin, Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, Rosa Luxemburg, Bukharin, Kautsky, Gilferding, of course, financial capital. And what we have, he wrote that the main profit is going to the pockets of the genius financial speculators. Is it true for 21st century? Yes. That domination on the market is in the hands of transnational corporations. Is it true? It's the case. That imperialism leads to the attempts to redistribute markets, redistribute spheres of influence, redistribute spheres of domination through political, ideological, and military means. Is it true? Yes. Of course, we have new qualities, as I described. We have new technologies. We have new threats, global threats. But the problem is still very similar. We had negation in the 60s when it was an attempt to build communism in our country, and not only in our country, in the world, really. It was a world movement for communism. Let's not forget about this. It was a social democratic model in European countries, and even in the United States, we had 45, 50% income tax for rich. But now we have negation of this process and restoration of very interesting combination. We have deglobalization as real growth of authoritarian state, nationalistic ideology, conservative culture. I can show more features, but everybody knows this. It's in every country. But this is only tool to increase neoliberal model of financial capital and domination of huge corporations. With all blah, blah, blah about small market, small is beautiful and something else, even about peasantry. And that's why if we want to have choice, we must have choice between two very different in the appearance, but very similar in the essence trends. One trend, again, we have in Russia, it's very visible. It's a union of the top bureaucracy with oligarchs, with, I cannot say even owners, but actors who control transnational capital. Because sometimes they have only 5–10% of the shares, or they are in shadow in general. Sometimes people even did not see these persons, these institutions. But this union of official bureaucracy and real bosses of transnational corporations, especially financial capital, those who control energy, information, raw materials, oil in Russia and gas and something else in other countries, high-tech production of high-tech innovations. This is new nomenclatura. in Russia, we had this word, nomenclatura. It was a name for top bureaucracy who controlled the country. Formally, they were nobody, just members of the Central Committee of Communist Party, but really they were masters. And now we have these new masters integrated. We have a model of bureaucratic oligarchic capitalism. But this type of late capitalism needs to have authoritarian political model, nationalism, conservative ideology, and culture. This is very dangerous mixture because this is also a process of refeudalization. It's very strange combination of very developed, very strong global capital based on the high tech from one hand and semi-feudal trends of the late feudalism with kings, monarchy, and so on, in politics, in ideology, and in culture. That's why we have this one force. And another force which looks like alternative. In Russia, this is even opposition. This is neoliberal, old neoliberal model of so-called free trade, which is really not free trade, but this is domination of little bit another type of global capital, financial capital, and so on, more oriented on the transnational integration and transnational transactions than national. On one hand, raw materials, energy, information, partly infrastructure, and of course, military-industrial complex. Other hand, neoliberal trend, more production of consumer goods, more finance, and more production of virtual commodities. This is visible contradiction because this is only two faces of the same late capitalism with totalitarian market of simulacra, with global domination of financial capital, and with really global capitalist nature. Only two faces, nothing else. But the difference is important because conservative trend is really extremely dangerous. It can lead to the fascism, and these trends are visible in many countries. In Russia, we have allergy on fascism in pure forms, but nationalism is, of course, very good. In Ukraine, we have open forms of fascism and open forms of nationalism, with strange mixture with formal democracy. Yeah, and this is trend everywhere. And what is important that neoliberal talks about human rights, freedom, and so on are also the lie, because it's really lead to the destruction of real national values, real culture, real human values, and so on. And the left are in this, I don't know, in this very bad situation when majority has choice, either Trump or Democrats, either Putin or liberal opposition. This is dead end. It's necessary to have a real alternative. And this real alternative is not destruction of globalization. It's not conservatism and nationalism. It's new type of integration, new internationalism. We need word internationalism. We do need this word now as theoretical problem because internationalism of the 21st century is new. We have this as practical need. We have this as national ideology. Internationalism as ideology of nation. Why Soviet Union had, of course, we had many very negative features in the past, but we had very big influence in the world. And not only because we have nuclear weapons and strong economy, but because we created free of charge education for everybody. We had millions of people from all countries of the world who can receive free of charge education. We have these big deformations, but officially progressive ideology. And we were trying to show alternative to the world. Of course, with, again, very big deformations, bureaucracy, and so on. So we need really, I will tell this openly, another vision of human values, culture, ideology, and of course, social economic program, eco agenda, and so on. And we do have this, but it's not simply to repeat again progressive income tax, big money for poor, and so on. We need not big money for poor. We need social jobs for poor. If we will simply give money to poor people, it will be lumpen, not even lumpen proletariats, but precariat lumpens who can be base for fascism, not for the left. It's useless to give money for poor people. It's necessary to give health care, house, education, and good work. This is attempt, and this is road, not attempt, road to create personality from destroyed personality. And we have billion, I think, of people who are in this terrible situation. And it's not problem of money. This is a problem of another social relations, another institutions, another ideology, and another culture. Without this, it's impossible to solve the problem of poverty. We can create maybe not very hungry, but absolutely stupid population, which will create fascism. And this is dangerous. The same with state. It's not the choice between liberal parliamentary state and conservative semi-monarchy or authoritarian state. We need to show the alternative. We need to think again about first steps of Soviets in our country, about experience of Paris Commune, about experience of Latin America, about experience of Asia. We need new model of state which will sleep, and then sleeping completely. And that's not because it's morning in Russia and I want to sleep. This is a very serious problem. So I think my time is finished. So I just wanted to put some important questions and to stress the importance of more deep understanding of globalization than simply international trade and international movement of capital and the universal quasi-values in culture. Thank you very much. Session.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And so now, well, later on we will have the interactive session where maybe you will be commenting on each other's views, especially where you disagree with each other. So now I would like to invite Professor Galip YALMAN from the Middle East Technical University in Turkey. So Professor YALMAN, he's Associate Professor of Political Science Emeritus in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the Middle East Technical University. He is the author of quite a number of books, including Transition to Neoliberalism, The Case of Turkey in the 1980s. He's co-editor of Economic Transitions to Neoliberalism in Middle-Income Countries, and also on the political economy of financial transformation in Turkey. He is currently the president of Turkish Social Sciences Association, which is the National Association of International Sociological Association. And I came to know Professor YALMAN when we were engaged in the project in 2011 on the comparing the 7 emerging countries. And so now over to you, Professor YALMAN.
Good morning and good afternoon at the same time, since we are taking part in this wonderful conference from different parts of the globe. And thank you, Kinshi, for remembering me, which we had a pleasant time, yes, as you say, exactly 9 years ago, July 2011 it was. And I'm very pleased that we kept in contact with you and with your colleagues. Now, listening halfway through the first session this morning, and of course with Professor BUZGALO, whom I met in EP conferences in the last number of years, number of times. Yes, we are discussing under the title of End of Globalization with a question mark, but we're actually living through what I call the pandemic-instigated crisis of capitalism. And in a sense, with this calamity of COVID-19 dawning upon the humanity, what we observe is a new round of speculative debates about the future of capitalist system. In fact, at different scales of analysis, from the global to the supranational and to the nation state level. And if some speakers referred to it earlier today, to the subnational level in many respects. So in a sense, I would say, what we are observing, living through, experiencing, has also an element of déjà vu in these debates, because they are in many ways reminiscent of those which had been expressed in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis. Strikingly, the notion of disaster capitalism, as the phrase was coined by Naomi Klein, in fact, prior to the 2008 crisis, to refer to the events that put, quote, the entire population into a state of collective shock, gains a renewed saliency, with the added emphasis that the pandemic is very much a social and human-made disaster. In fact, since the 2008 crisis, the world has witnessed a series of traumatic changes in the ways in which capitalist societies have been governed, as they have struggled to cope with the repercussions of economic, social, and humanitarian crises that have engulfed them. And with the visible failure to respond to the public health emergency, especially in the countries such as United Kingdom or the United States, there emerged another round of debates ensuing to ponder whether the crisis signaled once again because it happened in the wake of the 2008 crisis as well, whether we are experiencing the end of neoliberalism, as some put it, or the slow death of neoliberalism, as some others put it. Now, no doubt, there's also, in these debates, one could expect a renewal of interest in the very notion of crisis itself, particularly if conceived, as an opportune moment for real change. This was by Naomi Klein's book, was in reference to Milton Friedman, and more recently, this time around from a more critical perspective, as reflected in the title of the book by Philip Mirowski, Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste. So, in a sense, we have to focus about the nature of the crisis that we are living through. As an important Greek Marxist scholar, state theorist Nikos Planzas reminded us, way back in the mid-70s, the generic elements of crisis, due to class struggle, are always at work in the reproduction of capitalism. But this should not lead us to think that capitalism is always in crisis, because to do so, Planzas reminded us, dissolves the specificity of the concept of crisis. He also underlined that economic crises of capitalism are the very conditions of its extended reproduction and perpetuation. It is noteworthy that, at the same time, he portrayed capitalist states with a declining ability to manage the crisis confronting capitalist economies in general, and crisis of hegemony of the bourgeoisies in particular. This would in turn lead to the characterization of such episodes as recourse to the more direct or more concealed forms of authoritarianism and coercion, so as to alleviate the potential consequences of the developing crisis of hegemony. Another important Marxist thinker of the 70s, Busi Glucksmann, reminded us, in reference to Antonio Gramsci, that an economic crisis only develops into an historic and organic crisis if it affects the state and the apparatuses of hegemony, i.e. the state as a whole. Put differently, this meant a crisis could be characterized as organic when the very foundations of bourgeois hegemony were put into doubt. In this regard, the crisis of hegemony would also be characterized as a crisis of the state, not only because the state is being considered an integral part of the power bloc, but more pertinently, it is conceived as experiencing, as this is Planzas, again, as a crisis of the crisis management. This focus on the relationship between different kinds of crises, economic, political, hegemonic, that ensue in the context of crisis of the capitalist state at different periods, from the 1930s, if you like, to the 1970s and to the 21st century, has resonance once again currently in the context of what I call pandemic-instigated crisis of capitalism. So since 2008 global financial crisis, There was also the additional observation, which is somewhat problematic because it never happened only in the post-2008 context. It was the case from the 1980s onwards in many countries like my own, Turkey, that an authoritarian turn is said to characterize the experience of the several countries of the global south in particular, with or without a regime change. In fact, there seemed to be an apparent convergence of opinion that this particular economic crisis, though gaining systemic proportions and became protracted throughout the 2010s, did not produce a crisis of hegemony, since it was not threatened by a systemic alternative. That is to say, there did not emerge a working class challenge to the hegemony of the dominant classes and/or power blocks. So despite the global financial crisis, it has been held that the political forces in no part of the world have been able to break out of the neoliberal logjam. Hence its characterization as a crisis in neoliberalism rather than a crisis of neoliberalism. This is in fact in line with the conception of crisis, as Bob Jessup put it, as moments of indeterminacy, which in turn underlines the saliency of crisis management strategies in coping with the actual and/or potential challenges to the existing social order. Yet, in the absence of such a challenge to neoliberal hegemonic rule, at least until now, the crisis had remained and will yet to see what will happen now in the foreseeable future, whether, in other words, a crisis in neoliberalism would be transformed into a crisis of neoliberal capitalism. What is pertinent in this regard is Gramsci's conceptualization of the crisis as a process rather than as an event. That is to say, as the process of neoliberal transformation is driven forward by a series of crises, as exemplified over the last few decades in several countries of the global south, as well as, more recently, in the so-called Eurozone area. Indeed, this particular conceptualization of the crisis has been reiterated as a developmental feature of neoliberalism in reference to the American economy in the wake of the so-called subprime crisis. While this kind of political crisis might pave the road for more authoritarian forms of rule, it has been purported that one could also entertain the idea that this could rekindle an opportunity for reclaiming and deepening the democratic institutions, which have been weakened over the last number of decades by the so-called long rule of neoliberalism. We are yet to see, as I said, whether we are about to see such a break. But in that regard, I found it rather astonishing as well as entertaining when I read a statement, looking through my files, a statement made by a Financial Times columnist back in 2009, where he put it that the only way to put the genie of financialization back in the bottle may require a pandemic. Indeed, one could say there has been a series of arguments lately which can be read as a kind of confirmation of this prophecy from seemingly opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. On the one side, there are calls, as mentioned earlier today, for a managed retrenchment in international capital freedoms, albeit put under the rather peculiar banner of multilateralist deglobalization. On the other side of the spectrum, there are arguments which stated that the historically unprecedented crisis of 2008 marked the peak of financialization, whereas the equally novel coronavirus crisis crystallizes its deterioration. If true, that meant an unraveling of neoliberalism, since financialization came to be considered as an integral feature of neoliberal capitalism. More pertinently, this gains significance since the pandemic-initiated crisis is essentially a crisis of social reproduction, and we should remember that social reproduction has been governed by financialization processes under neoliberalism. Put differently, we could put the question as whether the current crisis could pave the way for the emergence of a new regime of social reproduction by putting an end to the commodified market-based regime of social reproduction or not. An editorial in the Financial Times in April this year would reckon that, quote, radical reforms reversing the prevailing policy direction of the last 4 decades will need to be put on the table so as to cope with the economic and social repercussions of the pandemic. Whether or not such a policy reversal is to be realized, the verdict, which is quite widely shared, it seems, across the spectrum, that the crisis through which we are living is a turning point in history. If so, we may put the question in the way as Gramsci put it, way back in his prison notebooks. Whether or not, in other words, what has increasingly become the crux of economic life is in crisis, its scale is such that quantity becomes quality. That is to say, the crisis is now organic and no longer conjunctural. This is something to ponder about the period that we're living through. As the pundits, however, who have been expecting a recession for the global economy well before the arrival of the pandemic, had been asserting that, quote, the policy toolbox for responding to a crisis remains limited. In other words, reiterating what Plantzas a couple of decades earlier had already stated, that we are living actually in a protracted way in terms of a crisis of crisis management. There were, nonetheless, a series of attempts, as you may all be familiar, on the part of certain Western governments to put forward, quote, unprecedented measures for unprecedented times, as the conservative finance minister of the United Kingdom government put it. They are meant to provide liquidity to prevent bankruptcies during lockdowns and maintain links between workers and their firms, which are considered essential, so that the workers are furloughed rather than fired. Such job protection schemes, which have the support of trade unions, obviously, in providing social safety nets for their members, tended to interrupt, albeit temporarily, the hierarchical order of markets within which the commodity and labor markets being governed by financial markets to a great extent, as we know, in the neoliberal era. However, these measures, in other words, obviously far from being adequate for the working people in general, in the light of the solitude of the workers involved in various forms of precarious work and left with no means of support once the economic activities have come to a standstill, or worse, as they are forced to make a choice, as Professor Reich, former labor minister of Clinton administration, put it, between risking their health and putting food on the table. Their predicament would, in turn, revive a late 20th century debate about the pros and cons of basic income schemes, whether applauded as a means of crisis management, in lessening the economic insecurity of the precariat, gig workers, or what have you, or opposed by a different perspective for severing the link between welfare and the labor market. Nonetheless, to cut a long story short, because this debate is quite lively and still being pursued by different participants, nonetheless, there arises calls for a post-pandemic world that would be contemplated as one in which people have access to work and the dignity it brings, an objective that requires job guarantee schemes that would ensure the right to work. But funnily enough, such calls would be putting the phrase rather problematically, in my view anyway, in terms of the decommodification of work. So it is interesting, the way in which people are juggling with the terminologies. Yet these schemes and various stimulus packages, so-called, brought to the agenda at the nation state as well as in the case of the European Union at supranational levels, could also be perceived as signifying what historian Fernand Brodel had underlined, as an essential feature of the history of capitalism. That is, its capacity for change and adaptation, especially in times of crisis, so as to prepare the ground, if you like, for the capitalist classes to direct and control change in such a way as to preserve their hegemony. As for the increasing emphasis for the role to be played by the capitalists in response to the economic and social crises aggravated by the capital pandemic, in reference to what I said, whether we are living through a period in terms of whether you call it a slow death or the end of neoliberal globalization, it is necessary to remind ourselves that the idea of a state withdrawn from the economy amidst the globalized phase of capitalism was nothing but a neoliberal myth, simply because neoliberalism is characterized by the systemic use of state power to put into effect a hegemonic project of recomposition of the rule of capital in most areas of social life. So with these thoughts, I end my contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor YALMAN. So now I would like to ask, to invite Professor Melani BUDIANTA from Indonesia to give her presentation. So Professor BUDIANTA is Professor of Literature and Cultural Studies at the Faculty of Humanities of University of Indonesia in Jakarta. She has been working on issues of cultural diversity and tolerance, anti-violence, and women's empowerment. She is also a very long-standing member of the ARENA community. Over to you, Melani.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm just going to share some small initiative coming from the villages and kampungs. So this might not really work to reverse what we have talked about, the forces of globalization, but just a kind of intervention which might be supported by us if we are willing to consider this. So I start with the word kampung. Kampung is actually the term for rural or urban informal settlement. But the term refers more to a sort of a cultural kind of idea rather than administrative unit. This term kampung has connotations. Of course, this is a very and also neoliberal connotation. One, if it is rural, it's usually rather exotic. It's a nostalgic place of origins, because mostly urban dwellers have some village and rural origin. But if it is urban kampung, then it has this pejorative meaning of it's a place where there is backwardness, slum, or place for regulation when there is crime or unruly behavior or commodification. Now, what can this term mean for initiative from below? First, we start with this dream of smart city all over the world. We know that now the world is started with this project of megacities. Even Indonesia started to create, November 2018, 100 smart city program, right? To increase the urban quality of life. But bang, we have this pandemic crisis, right? Is it the end of the era? Maybe not, right? Is it a crash? It's a crash, a crisis of global capitalism when transnational traffic is on hold, budget plan of developmental is draining, urban consumption affected, And as we already talked before, there are many already warnings about this trajectory of neoliberal trajectory. And now in my country, at least, there is a anxiety or yearning to return to the new normal after this lockdown and everything, with adjustment, with adaptation. So what does it mean? Is the old work plus health protocol? Is it continuing the journey towards, another set of crises which cost humanity and the earth? I'm going to talk about most vulnerable communities. One is the sprawling informal urban settlement, which is urban kampung. and the other one is the rural villages or rural kampung. Right? The pandemic impacts on rural and urban kampung is quite severe. But first of all, the pandemic does not start or did not originate in rural or urban kampung. It started from upper middle class clusters in urban centers. Then it spread to the periphery. Well, the rural area, we have this myth that it's less polluted, more open spaces, so healthier living environment. While in the kampung, in the urban kampung, it's of course very crowded with limited space, poverty, so it's more problematic. But we learned that the virus is migrating everywhere. And when it went to the rural area and the urban area, the urban kampung, they have minimal health facilities, minimal support. So because now the urban and rural are interlocking inseparably, complicated network with actually very imbalanced power relation, always benefiting the city, the urban, the rich rather than the marginalized urban poor, right? Now, the economic impact of the rural area is loss of income as national and international agents or distributors stop buying and distributing rural produce. It's an urban kampung. Many urban dwellers in urban kampung lost their job as manual workers in residential and industrial areas. Plus, there are many returning migrant workers from all over big cities in Southeast Asia, back to the villages without support system in the villages. And both urban kampung and rural villages lack food resilience because of the developmental project that has occurred for many, many years. Now, even before the pandemic, actually the government, Indonesian government has already talked about capitalizing the rural, shifting trajectory towards the rural, building Indonesia from the rural village. It sounds very nice, but it still has very neoliberal developmentalist orientation, which in the end will not be very beneficial to them. This is an example. In the urban kampung, there is this project of commodifying them to become, like rainbow kampung or whatever, with very superficial kind of project of making them sites for tourists. Actually, these tourists actually disrupt their everyday life without benefiting them at all. Just only some, probably money from selling some food, etc. But otherwise, it will not change their life at all. And in kampung, in rural area, there is land grabbing, mining exploitation, and then loss of agricultural fields. Not to mention climate change effect, landslide, natural disaster. And there is a conversion from rice and cornfield for consumption into agrarian export commodities. This is happening all over the rural area in Kalimantan, Sumatra, Northeast Timor. This shift into oil palm, this shift into cocoa, and thus they don't have enough vegetable, not enough stock for their own nutrition, and then there is stunting, a phenomenon of stunting from in babies and children. With the developmentalist project, there is human resource depletion due to migration to cities. And now, urban consumption and lifestyle is coming to the most remote area in the country. With transactional mentality and social cohesion is already being sort of degraded. So there is a poverty and social gap here. So we see that developmental framework enrich cities and marginalize urban and rural kampung. So what to do? What with this kind of a crisis? Shall we continue this project? And now I'm sharing with you a kind of idea. This is still a kind of a utopia of building a cultural commons as alternative to state and capital participation. Of course, this has been tried, and some it might not work. But I want to share with you some initiatives. Now, there is a many now movement among the kampong and rural and urban to connect with one another and to start a digital networking to do what they call as kampong commoning using the hayloft as a symbol. Hayloft is a place where they keep rice product, especially for storage in time of crisis, etc. And this is now being revived again with a different kind of meaning. You know, I will show some initiative. This is very poor village, mostly widows, and with less than $100 a monthly. You know, and they have nothing. But then one villager is inspired by a TV program, and they create a live-in project for Jakarta, kid, and organize the whole village to recall again traditional art game, to find their own identity, cultural resources, and then they share income to build commoning for the for not only for welfare, for food, and they started to organize culturally. Another example. This is initially a rural village, but turning into urban kampong because of the city expansion. And then now is surrounded by gentrified urban middle class residential area. They will be, soon the kampong will be gone because the price of the land is starting to get very high. But they want to stay there. They want to save their neighborhood. So they start to find a kind of cultural commoning, inviting activists, scholars from all over the place to help them do a kampong branding by using their name, which means kerosene lamp, because before they don't have any electricity, to revive, to have a festival, to remember their time, etc., etc. And they have now yearly festival. Now the kampong is safe. They are not the city used this for the place for a kind of a place where people can visit, kind of tourism in a way, but a different way of tourism. And from this initiative, they started to have initial networking, digital networking with other villages, urban kampong, the whole Indonesia. There are about 50 kampongs network, and then there are another kampong. So it's a kind of movement everywhere. This is another example. Tanah is in East Java. It's a village, a sending point of female migrant worker to Asian countries. They want to reverse back the migration. How to do it? They try to reawaken local cultural games, which is children games called Sambu Still, and they create this as a festival to empower left behind children, because many children are left behind by the parents, and the village are empty, only elderly and children. And they start to reinforce the local language and try to create a concept of collaborative care, the whole village as a collaborative craft of left behind children. And now they start to make school for grannies, center for critical literacy and transformative learning. So these are initiatives from below, and now getting support from many institutions, from international institutions and activists and other things. So they start to regain again the collective history, expanding literacy, and trying to produce again the cultural memory. Now, this is I call it a smart kampong, not smart city, but smart kampong initiative, because they reverse the urban modernist case from kampong as a problem to kampong as an antidote of urban ills, to reverse it from transactional mentality to more solidarity. Reversing kampong as an object to subject of tourism, not a place for tourists to come, but a place for learning. Making use of the existing capitalist framework, branding, marketing, to actually intervene in it and to put themselves in it. Yeah? And kampong activists became an embedded actors who builds network, all pooling resources from all over the place. And they use digital platform as tools to put their kampong on the map. And this digital networking is transdisciplinary, collaborative. Some, government officials are involved in the. It's very informal, but at the same time involving so many people. So they have this kind of idea. This is, of course, very ideal. Many problems occur, of course, in the process. They have this communal hello as not only food but collective rebuilding of common resources, and they have festive gotong royong before the pandemic to create events always in a festive spirit, and then also events of visiting other kampungs to support one another. Now this is an example of the pandemics in urban Jakarta kampungs. We see this from the left, a woman in the kampung house chipping in a cup of rice every day. They chip in cup of rice in order to put as the kampung storage, food storage, so that later on they can distribute when they need it. And then next, this is a technology, small technology, a local technology of building disinfectant from whatever they have, drums or whatever. And the initiative to build shelter in Kapong and surveillance center, not only for COVID, but also for drug dealing, etc., etc. And then there is this initiative of making plastic bucket for fish, urban farming, how to do urban planting, urban farming again, and making digital chat group for promotional outlet, and also distributing rice packages, all this initiative in kampungs all over Jakarta. Actually, they started this initiative and making because at this moment, the government at the state is actually a little bit paralyzed. They are paralyzed because of so many things. So the initiative helped them to survive the daily life. So this is the sort of the idea working of the commoning. Actually connecting the urban and the rural because of the urban migration, and they always returns, it's in a cycle. So they have this network of digitally mediated interaction between the urban and the rural, and involving universities, NGOs, and state governments, and also the private capital to help to have this kind of initiative. Now, in conclusion, of course, the state and capital developmentalism is a kind of creating megacities and kampung as tourist attraction. It creates more problem rather than helping the communities. The kampung commoning is a strategy, a small, and it's maybe just a survival strategy to create an open, inclusive, participative, and digitally connected multi-stakeholder collaboration, utilizing what is there, local resources, to be relearned and to recreate it, to be recreated again, to actually to resist, but to live in, to survive within this existing globalized condition, right? Of course, there are many traps and complexity. First, tricky negotiation between state and capital. We talk about this return of this state, that is a totalitarian state, and also the way democratic apparatus sometimes is hijacked by the village elite or the government elite. Also, the very serious problem of identity politics, conservative politics, all these are happening on the ground. The kampung commoning, they face it day by day, right? But it is just I share this story as a model of small community networking and transdisciplinary commoning to intervene into areas that have not been totally subjugated. Of course, it's been subjugated, but there is still some space to move around. And I offer this as a locus. Probably, I don't know whether it will work or not, for South and South collaboration, maybe regional collaboration. Because are there many kampungs, something like the same? Because the South is in the position of I see a metaphor of kampung in a way in today's globalization. We are another kampung. How can we help one another? It is one strategy, maybe not to reverse, but to sort of intervene creatively by making the daily life more humane, more cultural, more egalitarian, and more culturally, ecologically friendly, at least for people today. I end my presentation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Melanie. So, can I now invite MUTO Ichiyo-san to speak? So, MUTO Ichiyo has been a critical writer on social affairs and activist in anti-war and other social movements since the 1950s. He was the founder of the English magazine Ample in 1969 and the Pacific Asia Resource Center in 1973. He has played a leading role in the People's Plan 21 program from 1989 to 2002. And he has taught. He had taught at the State University of New York during the period 1983 to 2000. And currently, he's working as a board member of the People's Plan Study Group. And the People's Plan Study Group has been co-organizing the South-South Forum all these years. So over to you, MUTO-san.
Well, the end of globalization, I couldn't understand well what Kinchi and the organizers meant by it. But probably it is related to the pandemic and also a great change that is happening in the global society. So I jotted down some ideas I have about what is happening and what will happen in the future, which I perhaps wouldn't share. But anyway, it's about Corona disaster, Corona pandemic. A very interesting thing about it is that it is a pandemic, global phenomenon. Therefore, a global measure, global program, global action to cope with it is required. And that is very, very obvious. But there is no such authority, global authority, to unite the people to fight or to cope with the pandemic. The United Nations is totally powerless. And WTO is the only interstate organization to do something about it, but it's not very, very effective. So what happened? What happened in the assertion of nation states? It is a nation state that intervened and that came up. And what it did, and it is doing, is to close the borders, to cut up the world into national segments again. So if you are talking about the end of globalization, if it is not an end, it is at least suspension of globalization. Globalization and its economic practice is now impossible to implement. No supply chains at work. If you have some trouble in your toilet, you can't expect it to be repaired because most of the things are made in China, and China can't supply it. And so it's a sort of the mirror of the danger of economic globalization that has been so completely controlled even the everyday lives of the people. So how can we interpret this? Does it end the neoliberal globalization that had been spreading so fast before this epidemic occurred? Or after this subsides, then status quo ante will return? We have to ask ourselves that question. And that depends on what happens or what we create during this interesting and dangerous period of suspension. One thing that is very interesting is that this pandemic, because it is pandemic, affects all the people. So it's a sort of equalization effect in a way, because it is a body that is attacked, not directly wealth or property, but a body. So in that sense, there's an element of equality. But how does that equality works? It makes visible, very, very visible, the existing inequalities. There's no such thing. If it is money, then you can allocate some funds for the poor people. That kind of thing is possible. But in this case, it's one sort of standard. And application of that standard by a virus makes visible tremendous injustices and inequalities visible. So we see different mortality rates among different groups of people. Blacks die, more blacks die than whites, kind of thing. I don't go into figures, but these are very widely reported. Naturally, the pandemic situation stimulates and ushers in struggles for the rectification of wrongs, rectification of inequalities, which is perceived as a historical product, not just an existing inequalities, not just unequal rates of mortality because of corona. I think it's a very important aspect. Of course, we hear about the movement, spontaneous movements, I think, in America, under the slogan of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, of course, for all. But that sense of Black Lives Matter is brought forward by the fact that so many Black lives are being lost at the hands of the police and by the epidemic. So a process which is very, how can I say, heartening, provoked by this disease, is that we may be coming to a place in history where we can sort of unwind the entangled ramifications, entangled development of history. Of course, that is a sort of wishful side of the thing. And what is happening is very, very serious suffering. Well, now we are talking about the history of pandemics, Spanish cold, Spanish influenza, etc. Well, smallpox, particularly pestilence, that changed the course of history. But I think just placing the current situation in the history, in the context of the history of pandemic isn't enough. Because not only that, but also global climate change is happening. And pandemic itself is said to be the result of the destruction of forests. The paradigm of development destroyed the habitat of animals, wild animals, bats, etc. And that bounced on us. So what we are facing, what are we facing? Just a concept which is relatively new, but now shared by increasing number of people. Anthropocene. I think that should be elaborated, because what is happening is not just a matter of environment, but a new geological era introduced by human civilization. And that is pervasive. And that changed the way the globe exists. And if it is so, and I think the people who are saying so are actually right in saying that. So we need to face it. How? My conclusion, which I can't elaborate now, is to make economy political. Change the law of economy, the iron law of economy, by building up people's force to affect, to force that law, that rule to change. So we need to go back to the 20th century and reconsider all the achievements and failures of socialism. I think that's the most important thing to do. And while fighting against the expressions of various bad things, we need at the same time to think on a broader basis and try to sort of make a boring, I mean, in order to reach water underground. Well, thank you.